Hey everyone, thanks for joining me at the movies. We are in this series where we're taking a look at blockbuster films and we're diving deep into the storyline to find some truths that we can actually apply to our lives. Today's movie is no different. We're looking at Tenet. Christopher Nolan, the director, does an incredible job in his movies of bending time. Think of films like Inception, and today's movie is no different. So we're going to answer a couple of questions like, what should I do with my time? How should I be spending it? By the end of today's talk, we're going to answer that and so much more. As a fun fact about this film, I actually found myself in Los Angeles International Airport a little over a year ago on the set of this movie as it was being filmed. It was a fun experience, and I'm super excited to share not only the movie, but some of the powerful truths with you guys today. Well, grab your popcorn, I've got mine. Let's take a look at the movie Tenet.
We all believe we'd run into the burning building. But until we feel that heat, we can never know. You do. You chose to die instead of giving up your colleagues. That test you passed? Not everybody does. Welcome to the afterlife.
To do what I do, I need some idea of the threat we face.
As I understand it, we're trying to prevent World War III.
Nuclear holocaust.
No. Something worse.
All I have for you is a word. Tenet. It'll open the right doors, some of the wrong ones too.
You have to start looking at the world in a new way.
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
What the hell happened here?
Hasn't happened yet.
Well, Tenet is a phenomenal film, and if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I highly recommend it. Christopher Nolan, as I mentioned before, the director of the film, he really loves to bend time in his movies. And in this particular film, he introduces the concept of inversion. It's the idea that you could be moving through time in a forward motion, but you or an object that you control could actually be moving in reverse. It's mind-blowing, I got to admit. As I was watching the film, when I got to the end of it, I couldn't tell if I had watched the movie from beginning to end or if I had started at the end and watched it back to the beginning. It messes with everything that you think about when you think about time. There was some things though at the beginning of the movie and at the end of the movie, something that was colored red, that gave the movie some real context, some bookends. I don't want to spoil it for you, but pay attention to those things in red if you watch the film for yourself. Well, context is a big part of what we're talking about today. So what does context have to do with how we think about our time? All right, can't wait for this movie. Tenet's a fantastic film. In fact, the two heroes, or perhaps they're not really heroes in the movie, constantly look to try and go forward and sometimes backwards in time in order to fix things. But you don't really know for sure, are they going forward or are they going backwards in time in order to fix those things, in order to save the planet, to save the world? As I watched the film, I was constantly thinking of time, constantly thinking to myself of how I actually use time. because there are things that I wish I could go back in time and forget or even fix. There are things that I wish I could go forward in time sometimes, because I think if I were to do something, it might work out for the better. No matter what, we can't move back or forward in time, but I think it does help us to answer the questions, how am I using my time? Am I using my time to the best of my ability? Today we're going to take a look at an ancient prayer from the book of Psalms. It's a book that's actually part of the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures. And this particular writer didn't write much of the Psalms. In fact, most of the Psalms a famous king, King David, wrote. But Moses wrote this one particular psalm that I think is going to help us gain context of how we use our time to be the most wise with it that we possibly can be. We're ready for the movie. In the psalm, Moses records a prayer in Psalm 90. It reads in this way: Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Essentially, Moses is saying that God has been their anchor. No matter where they were, no matter where they were at in history, God's always been their anchor. His prayer goes on. He says, before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Here's what Moses is doing in this particular statement. He's giving context to his life in the context to God's existence. Just like at the beginning and the end of the movie Tenet, there's a little clue that gives you context, something that's read that you can pay attention to that kind of bookends the beginning and the end of the movie. Moses does the same thing with his existence in the context of God being from everlasting to everlasting. He continues, and that's really important, that context. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, mere mortals. I think to myself of grand movies where somebody commands something to happen, a superhero, and all of a sudden that person just goes back to dust. Moses in this moment says that God, you have the same power to command us mere mortals to return to dust from where we came. Then Moses gives us some insight into how God sees time. This is a powerful perspective on time for all of us to consider. He says this: 1,000 years, God, in your sight are like a day that has just gone by. Think about that. 1,000 years to God is like a day of our time. That means that for God, a day is like 365,000 plus days for us. That's a long period of time, and yet God just sees it as just a moment in history. He goes on, he says, God, you sweep people away in the sleep of death. They are like the new grass of the morning. In the morning it springs up, but by evening it is dry and withered. That's a little bit depressing if you ask me. As Moses is praying this prayer, he's essentially saying to God, my life is literally like a day. It springs up in the morning like new grass, but by the evening it's dry, it's withered, and it's done. Moses, this is not very uplifting, and right now it's not giving me great context or great perspective on the time that I have with my life. But don't worry, Moses is going to reveal something to us that is incredibly helpful. He says this: our days may come to 70 or 80 years. This is written thousands of years ago. And yet Moses understood that our days are numbered, that we would probably only live to maybe 70 or 80 years, if our strength endures, he says. Yet the best of those days, the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and will fly away. Again, Moses is doubling down and he's saying our lives go by so quickly, and on top of that, even the best of our days are struggling. We're struggling through even the best of our days and the best of our years. Moses, would you please give us something that we can hang on to? Then he goes on and he says something that's actually a little bit strange. Listen to these words. He says this: if only we knew the power of your anger, God. What does he mean by that? He says, your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. Those are some strange words that Moses gives us, but here's essentially what Moses is trying to say. Moses is saying that if we fully understood the greatness of God, His wrath, His anger, we would actually give Him the reverence that He is due. We would give Him the respect that we should if we fully understood the grandness of who God is. He's helping us to understand that in the context of everlasting to everlasting, God is incredibly grand. And when we look at our lives and we realize it's just a blip on the radar, by itself, our lives could become completely meaningless. In fact, we could lose hope and we could despair thinking, what's the use of even living? But when we understand the greatness and the grandeur of God's story from everlasting to everlasting, it provides purpose and meaning to the small part that we play, not in our story, but in His story. When you understand the context of God's story throughout history, we understand that our small part plays a big part in His story. Then he wraps up his prayer with this incredible statement. He says this, "Teach us then, God, to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom." What does it mean then to number our days so that we can get this heart of wisdom that Moses is talking about? Well, what a great movie. Popcorn was good too. So, Moses, you've taught us that our time is really, really short. But when placed in the context of everlasting to everlasting, our short amount of time can have significant meaning and purpose. So how do we actually number our days, like Moses said? Well, I want to give you a practical thing you can do this week to begin numbering your days. Right here, I have one of my favorite things to eat when I go to the movies. I love popcorn, but I also love Skittles. Inside this jar of Skittles are thousands, literally, of Skittles. When you take a look at your time, you can actually find out how much time you have left in your life if you were to live an average of, say, 70, 80, or 90 years. There's a great website. It's called failflow.com/life. You can enter your date of age and you can enter in some information and it will let you know how many more weeks that you have in your life. I know it sounds a little bit depressing, but it's a great way to begin numbering your days like Moses encouraged us to do. For me, in this season of my life, I have a little over 2,400 weeks left to live. And this jar of Skittles is a great reminder of how many weeks left I have to live. So why don't you do it this week? Discover how many more weeks of life you have left to live as you begin to do what Moses said by learning to number your days so that you can gain a heart of wisdom. Here's what I've discovered. When I see how limited my time is, it actually causes me to limit what I do with my time. When I can visually see how much my time is limited, it limits the things that I do with my time. Andy Stanley, the author and speaker, said it this way: because our time is limited, we should limit what we do with our time. Let me repeat that. Because our time is limited, we should limit what we do with our time. So how about this week you begin to number your days so that you can gain a heart of wisdom? A little over 2 years ago, I met with a guy for the first time. His name was Mark. I remember the day that we met. I remember the picnic table that we were seated at. And I remember how passionate he was about creating churches that people that don't normally go to church would love to come to. Kind of like what I do every single day of the week. We hit it off. We developed a close friendship. But 2 years later, in fact, just a short while ago, my friend Mark was diagnosed with a cancer that ended up taking his life just a little while ago. I'll never forget when I sat at his funeral thinking to myself, If somebody had walked up to that picnic table 2 years ago and told me that Mark only had 2 years to live, I wouldn't have believed them. But that's the reality. That day that I met Mark, he only had 104 weeks left to live. I wonder what we would do if we knew how many more weeks we had to live. I wonder if that would have changed anything about my relationship with Mark or changed how we lived those 104 weeks. See, we don't know how much time we have left, but when we begin to number our days, we gain a heart of wisdom. That's what Moses said. Maybe you have 104 years left to live. Maybe only 104 weeks. Maybe it's only 104 days or even less. Maybe only 104 hours or 104 minutes. But here's what I know to be true. When we know how much time we have left, we live that time differently. The reality is, because our time is limited, we have to limit what we do with our time.